There we go.
The old on-off switch.
Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to SOFREP Radio. SOFREP Radio, on time, on target. We have a very special guest for our listeners and viewers today for our YouTube channel. Toby Harnden has written a fantastic book, and we encourage all of our readers and listeners out there to check this book out. It's called First Casualty. It's about the first CIA paramilitary teams in Afghanistan when the war started back in 2001. It's a fantastic book. If you're looking for a Christmas gift to give some loved one or close, or you want to give a gift to yourself, definitely check this out. So without any further ado, we're going to welcome Toby to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. And, we were talking offline. I know, our listeners always love to hear about somebody's military experience. You were in the Royal Navy. And so fill our listeners in a little bit about your military career and how you got into writing.
Yeah, sure. So, my military career was not very illustrious. Not nearly as illustrious as the people I sort of tend to write about these days, or your career, or probably most of your listeners. I joined the Navy in 1985, so it was just after the Falklands War. In fact, I was applying for the Navy, age 16. I joined when I was 18. During the Falklands War, I remember picking up the newspaper, and it was Coventry sunk, HMS Coventry, a destroyer. So it was real, but I got in just after that. And I was there for just about 10 years. I left in 94. And in 1991, I tried very hard to get involved in the Gulf War, but they managed to win it without me. And I was sort of stuck back in Scotland feeling very frustrated. I think probably, I went to lots of places. I joined ships in Hong Kong twice, went around Australia twice. I went to the Caribbean, Northern Europe, Mediterranean, all over the place. But it seemed like kind of not completely serious, and the Cold War was over, and I was kind of like, what's the point of this? That sort of thirst for adventure and service, that was just part of my upbringing. I'm fourth generation military. So my father was in the Navy. His father was in the Army all through World War II. He joined in the 1920s as a boy and then retired as a major, and the great-grandfather Army as well. And a great-grandfather on the other side who was Army, who was captured in September 1914 in France and escaped from a POW camp in Germany in March 1916, and survived the war as a career infantryman sergeant in 1914. So in a way, he had a pretty good war. I grew up, listening to these stories, and, we moved around a lot when I was a kid, but it was mainly in Manchester, northwest of England. It's kind of like, I don't know, the equivalent of Detroit or somewhere. And I just wanted to get out, and see the world and never go back to Manchester. And so that's what I did. And, how I got into writing, I didn't see that much of a difference in a way between the Navy and journalism, because it was, job changes every year or two, having to deal with people at all levels, from, like senior officers to, guys working in the engine room, and being able to get along with everybody. And that was kind of how news journalism in a way worked for me. And it was kind of a good background. And, I was naturally drawn to military stuff, and ended up early on in my career getting sent to Northern Ireland, which was just a fantastic job because, it was still a war, it was never, it was called the Troubles, but, it was sort of an undeclared war within the United Kingdom and insurgency. And at that time there was, peace talks going on. So you had that kind of interplay between the violence and the politics, which, made it the biggest story in the world for a while. And it was a very small sort of patch of ground. So it meant that whenever anything went bang, I was able to go there, and it was very kind of accessible. And so that got me off on the journalism career.
Yeah, and you've written a couple of books prior to this one. But what exactly, got you interested in this particular story in this particular book?
Yeah, so I mean, it's funny. You never plan it this way, but I look at the books as kind of steps. So the first one was about Northern Ireland, Bandit Country, about the Troubles, the IRA heartland, border heartland, rural insurgency. And, it had, the 6 IRA families and the IRA chief of staff sort of living on a farm, straddling the border, literally one half in the Irish Republic, one half in Northern Ireland, and therefore the United Kingdom, the IRA sniper team. They were making all the bombs in England, in South Armagh, and shipping them over. And, special forces operations, one that eventually took down the sniper team. So, I got into all that. And then, sort of almost 10 years later, the second book was Dead Men Risen. And actually a central figure, which was about the Welsh Guards, British battalion in Helmand in 2009. And, one of the key people in that book was, by then, a Lieutenant Colonel, Rupert Thorneloe, who'd been a captain in the Welsh Guards in South Armagh when I was then, was a kind of a source, I guess, and became a close friend. And he was the battalion commander and was killed in action on July the 1st, 2009. And so that got me into that. They'd lost a company commander and a platoon commander in the same battalion, which was the first time those 3 levels of leaders have been killed in the same battalion since the Korean War. And then, First Casualty, it's sort of very much, about Afghanistan again, obviously, but very much a kind of a 9/11 book. And I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, walking into the kind of newspaper office just as the first plane, hit the World Trade Center. And then I, watched, like so many others, watched an airliner fly into the second one. I was like, holy shit, this is it, And, I was frustrated. Once again, this is a bit of a pattern, I guess. Once again, I was like, I want to go to Afghanistan, send me. And they're like, no, you're covering the Bush administration. You got your feet under the table. There's a big story there. We've got plenty of people who can, we've got the guy from China and the guy from Jerusalem, and they can go to Afghanistan. So, once again, I was feeling left behind. But it was a great story, and it was a country at war. And, I vividly remember Mike Spann being killed and his affiliation with the CIA immediately being sort of declared. And I remember Shannon Spann, his widow, who was also a CIA officer, giving an incredibly moving eulogy at Arlington on December the 10th, 2001. And I wrote a couple of little news stories about Mike Spann. But then everything just moved on. It was, war on terror, anthrax attacks, and we moved straight into Iraq. And but that story of Mike Spann never quite sort of left me. And the horse soldiers and riding into battle on horseback, kind of great, incredible stuff. And then a couple of years later, strangely enough, I was in Iraq, in Baghdad, and sort of hanging out at the Hamra Hotel, sort of journalist hotel. And another reporter said to me, did you ever see the footage of that CIA officer in the fort, who's with Mike Spann? And I hadn't seen it, and I checked it out, and it was a guy called David Tyson, who was with Mike that day. And so he'd just seen Mike being killed during this prison uprising, Al-Qaeda prison uprising. He'd shot his way out. And there was just a little clip of just a couple of seconds of him running across the courtyard with a Kalashnikov in one hand and a pistol in the other. And then he bursts into this building, sort of straight into a German TV crew who just start asking kind of goofy questions. And I just remember seeing his eyes, his staring eyes, like classic 1,000-yard stare. And I was just fascinated by David and what he'd been through. And, you could just tell he'd killed all these people. He'd seen his comrade killed. He didn't know whether he was going to be killed in the next few minutes. He didn't know what he was facing. And you could tell his brain was on complete sort of overload. And so, I eventually, years later, tracked him down. 2013, I tracked him down through. He was a case officer based in Tashkent, a linguist, Central Asian languages guy. He spoke fluent Uzbek. He'd been an academic at Indiana University before joining the agency kind of late. I think he joined in 96. And so I sent an email to an academic who'd thanked him in some book acknowledgements. And I remember being in New Jersey covering Governor Chris Christie's re-election campaign and feeling pretty pissed off with the whole thing.
I don't blame you there.
I mean, and he was being a complete jerk, towards me.
Imagine that.
Right.
Governor Christie being a jerk.
Right. And then the phone rings and he's like, "Hey, it's David Tyson." And so I was like, okay, this is a little bit more interesting. And so we met in a Panera Bread in Vienna, Virginia, like in this DC suburbs, very close to where I am now. And, sort of bizarre, just completely sort of, mundane, surroundings, and meeting this guy that, had killed all these people and been through all this stuff. And he was friendly, but he couldn't, he was still serving, couldn't really engage much. But I did my best to keep in contact with him over the years. And sometimes I wouldn't hear from him for a year or two. But I became very interested in the whole Battle of Kalajangi because it had CIA, it had Green Berets from 5th Group. So Major Mark Mitchell, got the first Distinguished Service Cross since Vietnam, leading the sort of main rescue force. There was a SEAL there, Steph Bass, who was awarded a Navy Cross the same day as Mike Spann was killed because he crawled forward sort of under fire and located the body. You had the British Special Boat Service, the UK SEALs were there. You had AC-130s coming in the first time they'd been used in Afghanistan. You had a big friendly fire incident, 2,000-pound JDAM dropped on a friendly position, killing a lot of Afghans and resulting in the first 5 Purple Hearts of the Afghanistan war. You had this warlord, Abdul Rashid Dostum, right out of Central Casting, this kind of brutish, sort of murderous character. And John Walker Lind, the so-called American Taliban, who was actually Al-Qaeda, and this sort of weedy white guy from Marin County, California. So the story just seemed to have everything in one place. And so I just thought that this just would make a great book, a great narrative to talk to all these people. And so, fast forward to late 2019 and, I persuaded the publisher to give me a deal on this book. But like all book proposals in a way, or certainly all the ones I've done, it's really a leap of faith on the part of the publisher. You say, like, this is my idea, this is the concept, I've spoken to a few people, and this is kind of what I'm thinking. But trust me, it's going to be 10 times better. The finished product's going to be 10 times better. I can't tell you exactly how, because I don't know exactly who I'm going to talk to or where the path is going to lead me. But please trust me, it's going to be better. And so that's kind of what happened. I thought it was going to be a book mostly about the 6 days of Kalajangi, but once I started talking to David Tyson in depth, and then J.R. Seeger, who was the chief, who was diary-speaking case officer from Near East Division, who'd worked with the Mujahideen in the 80s, and then Justin Sapp, who was a Green Beret captain, who was seconded to the team, like 29-year-old guy, youngest guy on the team, still serving as a colonel. I spoke to him. And so once I spoke to those guys, I actually began to sort of concentrate my focus a little bit more on Team Alpha. So these were the 8 guys who went in first behind enemy lines. They went in on October 17th, 2001. And so I then kind of expanded the scope out. It was concentrated more on these 8 guys, but certainly all the Green Berets and the SBS and Steph Bass and all those people as well. But it became more of the story of those 8 guys at the center of those 8 guys from 9/11 to landing on October the 17th, to capturing Mazar-e Sharif, to Kalajangi, and then of course, Mike being killed and the sort of the repercussions of the last sort of 20 years or so. So it was kind of very much like a moving sort of target. And, it just developed in the way that it did.
Yeah. It's amazing because, as we spoke offline, this was like a classic OSS, SOE, type of story that our forebears in Special Forces and CIA, this was like the type of mission that they would have done in World War II, and going behind, becoming the insurgents themselves and linking up with a resistance force. And it's a story that needed to be told, and the amount of detail that you got into it, it's fantastic. Because you started off with, 9/11 and how it all kind of transpired. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was, did you have trouble getting, guys from the CIA to be able to talk to you? Did you have to go through the agency, or were you able to contact some of these guys directly?
Yeah. So, I just didn't know how that was going to work. And I was kind of prepared for the possibility that none of them would speak to me. I mean, I don't know how it would have. I guess it would have become a lot more about the Green Berets if that had happened. So David, I'd already made this contact with, and I thought I felt kind of quite strongly that he wanted to tell his story, and I know that he'd spoken to sort of internal audiences, and in a way, part of his sort of therapy was to talk about it. So I had this sense that he would talk. But it was kind of a weird, like, chicken and the egg sort of situation, because he was like, I do want to talk, but I don't want this to be about me. I want it to be about the team. And I want it to be about Mike. And, but he was the one who was there, and, I wanted him to talk so I could talk to the others. And so, I had to, kind of navigate that. And of course, these guys are, anybody that's had any contact with CIA, and I think Green Berets are similar, kind of species. They make their own decisions, so there can be a recommendation from somebody else on the team, but nobody's going to be served up on a platter to you. They're going to make their own decisions, and so but it was nearly 20 years on, so there were 6 surviving. So Mark Rausenberger, the medic on the team, who subsequently became a paramilitary. He died in 2016 in the Philippines on CIA duty. So there were 6 still living, and one was still serving, a guy called Andy, who's still serving in CIA. So we don't use his first name. But the other 5 had, and then there was Justin, who was still serving. But he was military, which is a different kind of creed from the CIA in terms of openness. And Justin was pretty happy to. I think he went through a PAO initially, but he was pretty happy to engage. And then J.R. Seeger, the chief, was sort of quite long retired and was writing thrillers, and so he was sort of out there. And so I went to those 3 first, and I was hearing about the others. Scott Spellmaier became very senior in the agency. He was a former Ranger who was wounded in action during the Battle of Mogadishu in 93. And then had become a paramilitary, and then became very senior, station chief in Kabul, and the senior CIA guy on the NSC during the Trump administration, political appointee, a non-political appointee, I should say, and he just retired. And Alex Hernandez, who was Sergeant Major, 10th Group, Special Forces, like storied career, ending up in a special mission unit. Then gone on to another kind of full career in CIA ground branch. And so, Andy, Scott, and Alex were the 3 that were going to be more difficult. Like, I was told, Alex is never going to speak to you. Quite professional, it's just not going to do it. Sorry. So after the first 3, I knew that the others knew about me. And Shannon Spann was kind of reluctant, but she spoke to me. And then, Hank Crumpton, who was head of Counterterrorism Center Special Operations. So he was running the war day to day for CIA. And then Kofa Black, his boss, the director of the Counterterrorism Center, I'd done interviews with them. So I think I built up, a bit of credibility and trust that I just didn't have an agenda. I wasn't an idiot. I kind of had done my homework. I wasn't wasting people's time, and I was kind of serious. And so at that point, I went to the agency, and I had no connection with them. I had no sort of, I had to get a friend to dig out the press officer's email for me. And to my surprise and, gratitude, they were very positive and almost immediately, very, very responsive. And they didn't open up the vaults and give me all their secret cables or anything. All my freedom of information requests were still turned down. But they did, say to Scott and Alex, for instance, we think this is worth doing. The agency's proud of the story, rightly so. And that was another button that I was pushing all the time, which was like, listen, this isn't, failing to connect the dots before 9/11. It's not, no WMD in Iraq. It's not enhanced interrogation. This is a pretty good story. You were successful,
great story,
incredibly successful. Yeah, in just a few weeks. And so, they gave the thumbs up to, sort of Scott and Alex. And, once I got to speak to Alex, we spoke for 5 hours, the first time, it wasn't a case of me trying to stop him, but if I wanted to stop him talking, I don't think I could have done. And, he's sort of still like that. Like once he's made his decision, he's 69 now. This is part of history. He's happy to talk about it. And then Andy, who was still serving, they facilitated that interview as well. So then I had all 6, which was, and I had I had people's diary. David had written a diary. There was video footage that had been shot. There was, some documents came into my possession, via, channels I won't disclose. But I was able to, it was a fantastic experience too. And that's where the kind of the detail, I think, came from, which I love. I love being able to build up the granular detail and sort of complete the picture, and at the same time link it to the sort of the strategic context and this sort of, big moment in world history, really. And then once you have the 6 people like that who've, they weren't always together. The team, just like the Jedburgh teams, would be three men often going off for days on end. But, everybody, some things they'd done together, but everybody had their own kind of, focus, which sometimes could be a little bit blinkered. And so at a certain point, it was very sort of gratifying. I felt I was able to sort of give something back to members of the team and say, oh, I think this is what happened because, Andy and Alex and Mark were doing this. I'm like, oh, really? Okay. And so, I think, and I've been told by them that I was able to sort of make sort of sense for them of something that they'd been part of. And so, it was great to be able to speak to all 6 of them. And at the beginning, as I say, there wasn't even one of them that was guaranteed. So, it's kind of funny how things work. I think COVID weirdly helped because people were a little bit sort of, reflecting. People were at home, and none of these guys
busy. Yeah.
were into. Yeah, that's right. And none of these guys were into wearing masks or, being isolated or anything, and neither am I. So it was like, great, yeah, come on, let's sit down and talk. So, it's funny how things work out. Yeah,
right at the beginning of the book, when you talk about Cofer Black briefing the president, and he's in the Situation Room, and the conversation that transpired to me, that was the hook right there. It's like, oh, this is really good. Did you actually talk to him?
Yeah. So Cofer Black lives in Great Falls, not too far from here.
Oh, yeah.
And he was kind of hard. He subsequently worked for Blackwater and become, somewhat controversial figure. So, and he's a wily old spy, who, was on the trail of Carlos the Jackal, and Bin Laden had him in his sights. So he's no pushover. So I had to sort of have validators contact him and stuff. And you had to sort of run the gauntlet of basically,
could you,
who the hell are you? You know?
Yeah. Could you fill our listeners in on what he was telling the president? Because I love this in the book, because I'm sure, and judging from the president's reaction, he's not used to hearing people talk so straightforward as
So Kofor Black, sort of a legendary Africa Division case officer who was heading the counterterrorism center, within which is the Alex Station, which is the Bin Laden unit. So they've been focused on Al Qaeda for several years, and they've been saying like Al Qaeda's coming. They're coming here. We've been through the embassy bombings in East Africa in '98, the USS Cole in October 2000, the Millennium Plot, and so it's kind of no surprise really to Kofor Black. And many of his team. And they had a plan. It was called the Blue Sky Memo, or if not a plan, a sort of concept of operations of how to operate, like you said, OSS SOE style within Afghanistan alongside the indigenous allies, as the insurgents against the foreign invaders who were Al Qaeda. And so on 9/11, it's kind of like Kofor Black is suddenly the man of the hour, and Pentagon doesn't have a plan. I thought they had a plan for everything, including invading Canada, but apparently not for Afghanistan in 2001. And so George Tenet, brings in Kofor Black into the Situation Room, and Kofor is he's a powerful big guy, he's a powerful presence, and he's got this. He went to some boarding school in England for a while. His father was a Pan Am pilot, so he's had this unusual upbringing, and he's got this sort of theatrical kind of manner and this incredible sort of turn of phrase. And, he's a case officer. And so he wanted to win over the president, and he'd worked out what type of person the president was, and particularly the president after 9/11. And we can all remember, with us or against us, dead or alive, and go get him and all this kind of stuff. That's the type of president Bush was. And that fitted in very much with the moment, and it fitted in with Kofor Black. But he knew that speaking sort of plainly, he probably wouldn't have tried this if it'd been President Obama, but he was like, Mr. President, when we finish, there'll be flies walking across their eyeballs, and this is some phrase he picked up in Africa. And so Bush is, and he's basically like, and Kofor's like, there are people going to be killed. And Bush is like, sort of, so be it. And that's what he wanted, not some kind of diplomatic kind of, plan or we're going to have 100,000 troops going in 6 months' time and conventional units. Actually, Colin Powell said that, the president wanted to kill someone. And that was the mood of the country. And that was the kind of the way Kofor Black framed it. And Bush went for it. And so the CIA is, leading the war, this, tiny organization compared to DOD.
Yeah. And, and then they put together as you said, like Team Alpha. I mean, was it like 33 or 36 days after 9/11? CIA has people on the ground in Afghanistan. And
actually in Afghanistan, so the first team that went in was Jawbreaker, which went in, I think, September 26th. So that would be 15 days afterwards.
15 days.
But they went into the Panjshir Valley, which was controlled by the Northern Alliance. So kind of a safe zone, relatively speaking. Ahmad Shah Massoud had been assassinated by Al Qaeda on September the 9th. So they were kind of leaderless. Well, they had Fahim Khan was the new leader, who was kind of useless. And they weren't fighting and they weren't moving. And so Team Alpha came in, so 17th, which I guess would be 35 days after 9/11. They were the first behind enemy lines, and they were with Dostum, who wanted to fight and had the ability to fight and did fight. But it was, it was all kind of cobbled together kind of on the back of an envelope, all of it was this kind of time where the bureaucracy was just pushed to one side. Of course, it all returned later on, but for those few weeks, there was Team Alpha was the core of it was a 4-man paramilitary team led by Alex Hernandez. But then they added on David Tyson, who was in Tashkent. So he didn't even join the team in headquarters. He was added to it right at the end, swapped out for a former SEAL. And then they added a medic, Mark Rausenberger. They added Justin Sapp late on. And so they had these 8 guys, and they never operated together. I mean, some of them had, the 4 paramilitaries had, but some of them barely knew each other. And they had no military kit because they, in case they were captured. So they, Justin went with a government credit card to REI, in Northern Virginia and bought a few $1,000s worth of kit. And David didn't have anything. I mean, he just got what was in his closet, basically. He had these sort of almost leisure wear, like hiking boots that he would then wore for 40 days. They took in Kalashnikovs. So everyone was using 7.62. They had Glock pistols, or David got a high power Browning pistol from the embassy in Tashkent. And, so it was very improvised, and the plan was just to get in there and work it out. And Dostum had fought for the Soviets against the Mujahideen, so J.R. Seeger, had sort of, he was the enemy in the 80s. And Dostum was sort of notorious for switching sides. And so, nothing was guaranteed. I mean, he could have opened fire on the team when they arrived. It's possible. And then there were Tajiks there who were nominally allies, like Atta Mohammed Noor, who was kind of the rival commander in the area. He was pissed because he hadn't got a CIA team or an ODA. And so he wasn't talking to Team Alpha when they arrived. And so there was a lot to work out. And, there was a possibility that Atta could have attacked Dostum and killed Americans sort of in the crossfire. And so, JR had to work all that out, manage the tribes, again, classic sort of OSS, SOE stuff. And they took in $3 million in non-sequential $100 bills, which helped. Dostum got $1 million on landing. That always,
that would help me.
Right, greases the wheels. And so again, going back to the OSS SOE analogy, which I'm really glad you sort of picked up on, because, these were the forerunners of the Central Intelligence Agency, but also Special Forces. And here we are, it's like full circle. Here we are in 2001, where you've got CIA and Special Forces, because ODA 595, the famous sort of horse soldiers, came in 3 days after Team Alpha, to link up with Dostum. They're operating together, and they're just going back to their roots. And it was just incredible, the delegation of power. Rumsfeld eventually got upset that it looked like we were going to win with captains on the ground. So he started sending in colonels, which didn't really help. And then a 2-star admiral came in, once Mazar had fallen. But in these early weeks, JR was, making all these decisions on the ground, talking to Hank Crumpton every day. But, he was making sort of, on the ground decisions with strategic consequences. And that was incredible. And again, of course, that changed, after the victory at the end of 2001.
Right. That's the amazing thing in the book. And I again, our listeners out there, I encourage them to check this out, because you have a handful. People think, the CIA went in there with 10,000 guys. They didn't. They went in with a handful, paramilitary guys, a couple of case officers, and a couple of special forces teams, and they took over the country. Yeah. Until the U.S. military, the Pentagon, had to get their feet wet, because they had to hand out, impact awards for guys who had no idea what they were doing. And I think that your book describes all that. But I wanted to bounce back to Dostum. As you said at the beginning of the podcast, he was straight out of Central Casting, and I thought you captured him incredibly well in the book. And what a character. He liked to play up the fact that he was a bloodthirsty, evil incarnate kind of guy with his men and his enemies. But then he also tried to impress upon the Americans that he was cultured and he had a couple of Cadillacs. But my favorite part of Dostrom, and I want you to expound on this because obviously you know a lot more from writing the book. But my favorite part of the book with him was when he kicked David Tyson early one morning and he said, "Listen to this." And there was a woman's voice on the radio. And I'd like for you to tell the story to our listeners because that just cracked me up. I thought that was hilarious. And it just goes to show how Afghan culture is very different than ours.
Yeah. So you're right. So that's exactly the way Dostum was. He tried to sort of play it both ways and he had this fearsome reputation. His men were terrified of him. So he assigned bodyguards to the Team Alpha guys and the members of the ODA. And so they'd have these little shadows. They'd be going for like a shit. And this Afghan would be following them and would be like, just leave me alone. Don't follow. And he'd be like, you don't understand. If I let you wander off and you step on a mine and you're killed, Dostum will chop my head off. That's so his own men. And of course, after this, he was, the man of the moment during this period, but afterwards, the State Department wasn't too happy with dealing with him and he was sort of a persona non grata sort of once again. But he was kind of a peasant, he hadn't been educated at, beyond the age of 12. And he'd sort of, he was grown up through the military, but he was like many of these sorts of guys. He had this sort of wit and this, intelligence. And he was a very sort of quick study. So, so David's just been on this, sort of mission to Sarab to link up with Atta and bring in another ODA and Team Bravo, CIA Team Bravo. And he's dog tired. He spent 13 hours on the most excruciating horse ride of his life. And so he's just sort of nodding off a bit where Dostum's on the radio, but they're all on the same frequencies as the Taliban. And so there's always a lot of like sort of banter and sort of taunting and essentially kind of psyops with the Taliban, like, I've got the Americans in here. They're going to kill you. You need to, change sides and come with me and all that. And so Dostum hears this, woman's voice. Well, at first he thinks it may be like a sort of hermaphrodite, some kind of, eunuch or something because he can't conceive of a woman being in an aircraft. So he was thinking it's a man with no balls, and so once they got over that, David's like, no, it's a woman. And so he immediately has this idea, that he's going to use this against the Taliban because, the concept of being killed by a woman, it would just sort of, screw them, like, I don't know, just mess with their heads basically. And that their whole concept of sort of, society, particularly the Taliban and, the position of women and all the rest of it. And so he says to David, get her to sing a song. And so there's this, F-16 pilot or whatever it was, Navy jet pilot. And she's like, I don't know any fucking songs. Like, she's like flying a jet and wanting to drop bombs, she's, and Dostum's like, she doesn't know any songs, like, what, like a poem or, and anyway, so it's like the Navy fight song in the end. She's like, oh, okay. So she sings this song of like, go Navy, fight Army and all this. And Dostum, he gets the radio receive. He gets one radio. He puts the two radios together and he's like, Commander Mahmoud, the Taliban commander, listen to this, and there's this, this woman singing this song pretty badly, I think. And then he says, so Commander Mahmoud, this is an American woman, who's flying the plane. And what she's saying is she's singing, I'm going to fuck you up. I'm going to screw you over. I'm going to, you have a small dick and, I'm going to kill you. And so it's just, it's sort of a joke, but it's classic sort of psyops about how to sort of, taunt the enemy and sort of, make them feel degraded. And So David thought that was incredible about just how quickly Dostum could, something he couldn't really understand initially, but he grasped that this was an opportunity that he could use to, use against the enemy. And that's what he did. And so, as you say, it summed up the way he was.
It was a great part of the book, because then she ends up dropping bombs on the Taliban, and they realize there's a woman singing up above them, and they could see the bombs coming down, and it's a woman dropping, which to them is horrifying, because the Taliban, they're so anti women being anything. But I just, Dostum.
And then later on.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dostum he loved this. So he became sort of like entranced by this idea of like women killers in the skies. And so later on, there's an AC-130 navigator called Alison Black, who's still serving, I believe, as a colonel in the Air Force. And she was nicknamed the Angel of Death, and so once again, it's even the American women are killing you now.
That's awesome. Now, I read at the back of the book that you actually got to travel, I think it was the end of 2019, and you actually got to interview Dostum.
Yeah. So actually, it was the end of 2020. So I was just coming back from Afghanistan a year ago, and strangely enough, the guy who was my translator then, we just got him out of Afghanistan. He's living in my spare room at the moment. He just got his work permit this morning. So awesome. It's been kind of a crazy year for both of us. And actually David Tyson and Shannon Spann, and other members of Team Justice App, other members of Team Alpha, and, the broader kind of, group of people has been sort of instrumental in getting Rahale is his name, getting him out. So that's been great. And I think he's going to end up being a great American. So I interviewed Dostum, and it was a pretty difficult interview to get. I mean, if I thought Kofor Black was hard to pin down, I mean, Dostum, he's survived like 8 assassination attempts or something, and he's always been kicked out, he's always in exile in Turkey. And then you have to find, obviously you can't just call him up. You have to find, who represents him, and all that. And so eventually, there was a sort of agreement that he would talk to me, at least in principle, but no date or place. And so I went out, in November 2001, I missed the US election, which was great. So I watched the results of the election on Indian TV in a hotel in Kabul, which was fine by me. I was sitting around in Kabul for a couple of weeks, getting a bit concerned about, like, is this going to happen? Because Dostum was supposed to be going to Kabul, but I really wanted to see him in Mazar-e Sharif, because that was his place, or Shebagan, actually more precisely Shebagan, which was his home base. And so eventually I got up there, and it was really difficult because the Taliban was controlling, most of the country outside the cities at that point. And it really brought it home to me that this thing's over, it's just a matter of time. And so I had to wait for, more than a week to get a helicopter from Mazar-e Sharif. I could fly commercial air up to Mazar, but from Mazar I had to get a helicopter. It took more than a week, because Taliban controlled the roads. But then all of a sudden, I'm there, and there's Dostum in his big Chopin coat, and he's old. Obviously, he's old. He's late sort of 60s now, but just this like sort of powerful, like emphatic presence, and he has, very fond memories. I mean, I think it was probably the greatest period of his life, working with the Americans in 2001. And then almost like a little boy, is very upset and just a bit perplexed about why the Americans, have not wanted anything to do with him, ever since. But, I mean, interviewing a warlord is definitely an experience, and I was
Yeah,
really
and
glad to be able to do
you know
it.
the bloodthirsty part of him is pretty real. I know that you mentioned one of the bodyguards who said, "Oh, well, if anything happens to you, he'll chop my head off." He was like a kind of a butcher in his own right. So I mean, and then
Yeah.
of course it's Dostum's wife. I guess it's not every day that women get shot by an AK twice while cleaning the kitchen. And it was supposedly an accident. I read that in the book. I'm like,
happens all the time.
Yeah. I always keep an AK behind the refrigerator, and who knows, it'll shoot twice on its own.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's certainly how his first wife met her end. And there's also a sort of, famous, sort of notorious incident of prisoners being killed in containers. And I think it's been hugely exaggerated over the years. And, like everything with Afghanistan, the numbers, go up from 100 and there's soon 1,000, and then it's 5,000 and 10,000. And, and then of course, propagandists will bring in, Americans were slaughtering people. But there were people, I did ask him about this because it is the reason why he was completely cut off by the State Department and effectively the US government. Although those who fought with him in 2001 still sort of revere him. And, I was surprised. I expected him to just completely deny everything. And he was sort of, one of my commanders, 2 of his brothers have been killed by the Taliban. He was, young and emotional. And yeah, he shot up one of the containers, killed a few of them. But it wasn't nearly as many as, I didn't know anything about it. And it wasn't nearly as many as everybody say. But, how do you become an ethnic sort of leader in Afghanistan, which is essentially a medieval society? I mean, none of these guys have got clean hands, and that's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah, and when you're talking about the Afghan culture, there's another part of the book that was, it almost turned into a bad thing, but I think it was David Tyson again. He was getting another duffel bag full of money, and he asked for some vodka. And, if you explain that a little bit to our listeners, I thought this was another part of the book that, it shows how different their culture and society is to ours.
Yeah. Well, also, I won't tell the story, but Dostum gets drunk on vodka at one point in the book at a crucial moment, but I'll leave that for just a teaser.
That was interesting as well, but the whole condom thing.
Yes, right. So this is in the mountains before Mazar-e Sharif's captured, and David, because he speaks fluent Uzbek, so he has kind of the closest relationship with Dostum's guys. So one of his commanders comes to him and says, his hand's shaking, he needs medicine. And there's a bit of sort of back and forth. And this guy says he wants devil's water, which is vodka. So the Uzbeks are often not particularly religious. They, drink and do other stuff that Muslims shouldn't. And certainly the fighters mostly. And in fact, there was one guy who was praying all the time, and they used to mock him and tease him as being in the Taliban because he was praying. So they're not, not particularly religious. And, but at the same time, you don't want to be seen to be, asking the infidels for, liquor. And so anyway, David gets some vodka sent in. He asks the station chief in Tashkent to put it in the next airdrop. And at the same time, there's another $3 million needed because the original three's sort of run out. And then Alex Hernandez is there, and he's like, case of vodka and, $3 million. That sounds like a pretty good party. Why don't we throw some condoms in there? And, he was just joking around. I think David knew it was a joke, but, he's on there and he says, yeah, okay, Charlie, who's the chief of station, we want some condoms as well. And so the next airdrop, it's, there's vodka, Uzbek vodka, Uzbek condoms, and the $3 million. And so these things arrive, and the Uzbeks are like, what are these? And so there's a lot of banter between David in particular and the Uzbeks about, different, cultural differences, and why do we stand up when we piss and they squat down, and and that's part of his sort of rapport building. And also he's just like, in a sort of anthropological way, just fascinated by people. And so they're like, what are these things, these rubber things? And he says what they're for, put them on your penis so you don't have more children than you need. And these guys are like, what? And it just couldn't, I was going to say they couldn't conceive, but that would not be the right word. They couldn't believe that why would anybody want to do such a thing? So again, this like huge sort of cultural gulf between, Afghans and Americans. And there's sort of like uproar. And basically there's a war that needs to be fought. But these Afghans are like, just, it's kind of making them a bit crazy. Like, what are these things for? And they're like trying them on. It's making it in there, like blowing up balloons, and they're flicking them at each other, and they're all like joking about it. And so in the end, David says, "What? I need to calm this thing down, because we need to get on horseback and go fighting." So he sort of calls a meeting and says, "Listen, I'm sorry, but it was just a joke. You don't put these things on your dicks. You put them on your rifle barrels to keep out water and dust, so they don't contaminate the weapon. I'm sorry, I was just joking around." That didn't quite explain the pictures of the sexy Uzbek ladies on the packets, but anyway, they bought it in the end, and so that was the condom story.
Right, but the story takes a serious turn because everything's going along swimmingly, and the fly in the ointment in the book and the way it played out on the ground was Donald Rumsfeld, because first he wanted, he was waving a paper in front of the president. I remember reading it in the book that they weren't doing anything, and then I think it was Covert Black that said we'll have Mazar-e-Sharif in 24 to 48 hours. And then, of course, he was very upset because, handful of CIA paramilitary guys in a Green Berets with, one or two officers and a handful of enlisted guys are taking over the country. So then he wants to get, high-level officers in there. And that's when basically right at Mazar-e-Sharif is where Dostrom gets pushed into the background.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the beginning of when everything started to go sour in the country.
Yeah. I'm really glad you picked up on that. I think that's exactly right. So Mazar-e-Sharif is captured, and Rumsfeld has been pushing this DIA paper that's saying it's we're going to be bogged down until the spring. But as soon as Mazar-e-Sharif has fallen, the kind of atmosphere changes. So conventional army starts coming in. There's a 2-star SEAL. So you've had basically the link man with Dostum was the ODA Captain Mark Nooch. He was sort of displaced by Lieutenant Colonel Max Bowers, who's the battalion commander. So they sent an ODC in. And then, within a week, Admiral Burt Calland, 2-star SEAL, is taking over from Bowers. So you can see the sort of escalation. And then also the sort of the comradeship you had between the ODA and Team Alpha, that kind of starts to change, because the ODA is actually, they're initially made to do the, personal protection for the SEAL Admiral. So they're not very happy about that. They're the whole soldiers, and all of a sudden they're just, personal security detail. And then the Green Beret mission and the CIA mission sort of starts to diverge. So the directive from CENTCOM and Task Force Dagger is that it's no longer sort of Dostum, but it's Dostum, Atta, and Moakek, who's the Hazara. They should be sort of treated as equals. CIA still doesn't see it that way. So the CIA is sort of, collecting intelligence, but there's this sort of sense, certainly from parts of the military, that the war's over and we can start bringing in support elements. And So November 25th, Admiral Callan's actually visiting a hospital, in Mazar-e Sharif, and he's got 4 SBS who are protecting him because ODA 595 managed to get off that detail. They've gone to Kunduz, where the main fight is expected. But, this kind of bond and this rapport between 595 and Team Alpha has just been sort of diluted, and 595 are not with them anymore. And I think that's one of the reasons why on the morning of November 25th, 2001, David Tyson and Mike Spann end up going to the fort on their own. And in fact, it's been a directive from Task Force Dagger that Green Berets should not go into the fort that day because there was a suicide grenade attack that killed 2 of Dostum's commanders the night before. And so there's a sort of a different perception of risk, not on the ground, but, it further up the hierarchy where the military is like, that's not safe. And the CIA is like, we're going to take the risk because we need to go talk to Al-Qaeda. And you're right. That's one of the things, that kind of shift was, a big contributing factor in, Mike Spann being killed and the uprising taking place.
Yeah, because, you could, and again, I mean, I wasn't there, but reading the book and you talk to all these people, you could sense everything which had been so tight and so, working so well. All of a sudden now everything's pushing apart and everyone wants their own piece of the pie. And, the State Department didn't, to them, Dostum was unpalatable. So they bring in Atta, who, just judging from the way you wrote the book, I don't have a very high opinion of this guy.
Right.
But, I just thought that you could sense that at that point, you could see where everything was going, and it wasn't going in a good direction. And, I was wondering in my own mind, reading the book, if they hadn't sent the ODA off, would those guys have either accompanied Mike Spann, or would they have said, hey, they'd have talked to him and said, it's probably not a good idea. We can maybe get some of Dostum's guys to bring these guys out for you to talk to them.
That's a great question. And I have definitely thought about that. And initially, I know that that's the view of the guys, most of the guys in the ODA 595, and certainly Captain Mark Noosh. And initially, I was a little bit skeptical about that. But I now think, having, thought about this a lot and talked to just about everybody, I don't think it was anybody's fault.
No.
But I think the dynamic, and I'm certainly not going to sit here in Northern Virginia 20 years later and say, oh, if only they'd done this, or they didn't follow procedures, or, that they needed to go in there and question Al-Qaeda. They'd been relying on the Afghan allies all the way through. They'd been taking risk every day. And, it was a national priority to find out. Yeah. And he was the personification of, and he was the personification of like, send me, I'm going, I want to get to Al-Qaeda. I want to stop the next attack. And so they were always going to go in there. But I do think that if 595, those 12 guys from that ODA had been in Mazar-e Sharif, I think they would have said, we're going to send a couple of guys with you. Now, David and Mike, first of all, there should have been 3 that day, but Justin was pulled off. He had to go deliver a vehicle. So again, it's just when bad things happen, it's just this combination of factors. If there'd been 3 of them that went in, and Justin was, Green Beret, it would have been a different day. But, there could have been other days where if one thing had changed, that would have been, a terrible day. Sure. As well. But, that's just the nature of life in these imperfect circumstances. So David and Mike were content with being protected by the Afghans. They didn't know that Dostum had left not even his B team, but really kind of a C team behind. They didn't know that they had a sense, but they didn't know the extent to which the Al-Qaeda, the 400 Al-Qaeda prisoners, and they were Al-Qaeda, not Taliban. There were no Afghans amongst them. The extent to which they hadn't been searched. And so, if they'd had all that knowledge, then they probably would have made a different decision, but they acted on the best information they had. But they were okay with going in without Green Beret. They weren't saying we need security, and that wasn't the way the agency and the Green Berets operated. I mean, the Green Berets were not there as security for the CIA. But I do think that if 595 had been there, Mark Neutral, Bob Pennington, the warrant on the team, or one of them would have said, I know you say you don't want anybody. We're going to send a couple of guys. They would have been okay. It just would have been that different dynamic. So that's a really perceptive question, because I think it gets to the sort of heart of sort of what happened, and why sometimes bad things happen. And it's only afterwards when we look back and we can.
Yeah, they had planned on having an uprising. They weren't there to surrender. That was the what came out in the end. But another interesting part was the fact that some of the people even in the agency started to question David Tyson later on, and Billy Waugh, who's a legend in both CIA and Green Berets. He was like, nope, they didn't do anything wrong. And I think that would be, if Billy Waugh says it's okay, then it's okay.
Right. So exactly. So Billy Waugh, so he went in on at age 72 on Team Romeo. So I think he celebrated his 92nd birthday a few days ago. But he was in Tashkent on November 25th when the uprising was happening. And I mean, he called it. He said, David Tyson, who was subsequently awarded the Distinguished Intelligence Cross. So, the CIA sort of equivalent of the Medal of Honor, the highest award. And I think only maybe about 3 dozen of those have been awarded in the agency's history. But he said, a guy did everything anyone could have done. And I mean, when Mike Spann, killed a few of the prisoners and was sort of overwhelmed and was able to shout, Dave, Dave, Dave. And David Tyson ran towards him and killed the guys on top of him. And so, he could have run in the opposite direction, or he could have frozen. So, I mean, he was, extremely heroic. But Billy Waugh also said, you need to look after this guy because people are going to question it. And certainly, I mean, Justin Sapp, told me about, sitting in the CIA cafeteria, before Mike's even buried, and people go like, what were those two guys thinking? Just, walking into that situation. And, actually Brian, it didn't put it in the book, but Brian, who was a Marine, who's still serving, very senior in CIA now, was a Marine with Mike Spann, was on Mike Spann's, course at the farm, along with, Shannon, who subsequently married Mike. He said that, in Iraq in, 2004, there's some Marine officer, trying to sort of mansplain, why they'd made all these mistakes in Kalajangi in 2001. And Brian's like, hang on a minute, I know what happened there. And so that's just, the nature of things, isn't it? That you'll get people who weren't there. And, sometimes other people like journalists and, commentators years afterwards, and I really, really try not to do this, who just, without knowing any of the context, with 2020 hindsight, will start saying, oh yeah, well, this is the way it should have been. And so David's, he's had to face a little bit of that over the years. It's not usually to his face. And he's a very sort of disarming person. Like, so he will sort of engage, and he doesn't portray himself. I mean, I think he is, but he doesn't portray himself as a hero. And he talks about the fear he experienced and how, a couple of days later, his hand was shaking so much that his rifle was knocking against a tank. And he was wondering what that knocking sound was. But that's, I guess that comes with the territory, and, but it makes things tough when you put that alongside survivor's guilt and, losing a friend and comrade. It's just sort of, I guess part of what you have to deal with.
Yeah, it was interesting because, like everyone else at the time, I heard about Mike Spann at the time it happened. And then later on, I did see that video of David Tyson in the compound. And at the time I thought this was a really small compound. But, after reading your book, I looked at, because, of course, Google Maps, you can find pictures of everything.
Yeah.
That was really a large place. Because at the time, as I'm reading the book, I was like, I had in my mind it was really tiny. And I was like, they dropped a 2,000-pound JDAM. If it was it's as small as I had it in my head, there wouldn't have been anybody alive inside there. But it was actually a lot larger. And the guys who went in, and you talked about that in the book, that was so well written, and the detail in it was fantastic, because you had the feeling you're transported right there with the guys like Mark Mitchell and the SBS guys, that went in to try to retrieve Mike's body.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so it's, I was there a year ago. It was amazing to be able to get there, and it helped me just understand. I mean, I always believe in, going to the place and putting the sort of boots on the ground, because it's very hard to understand an incident without sort of being there and seeing, how high the walls were, and as you say, the distances, and, what you could see from which angle. But yeah, it's a big place. It's like 19th century fort, built out of mud, sort of 12 feet thick walls. And these towers, so basically, you have towers north, south, east, and west, and then on like three of the, like northwest, northeast as well. And so, of course, it's like a medieval fort. You're exposed on the parapets between the towers. So when they got there, the 15-man rescue team split up, and 5 of them had to sort of go around counterclockwise from the east side to the northwest tower, and there were mines there, so they had to basically cross a minefield, and there was kind of ordnance, because there were shipping containers full of weapons that were kept in Kalajangi, which Al Qaeda obviously got their hands on immediately. So there's like RPGs and mortars and all sorts of stuff like sailing over the walls, landing sort of pretty close to them, and then to get into the fort. One of the Uzbeks took his turban off and just sort of tossed it over the side, so like Rapunzel. So they used the turban to climb up, and they had all these weapons and heavy backpacks and stuff. So they're like swinging around, and actually Steph Bass injured his finger doing that, and they're sort of having to climb up this turban. So. Yeah, I mean, it was incredible to. It's just I'm a great believer in that the best stories in life are true, and I kept on hearing these details of what they've been through that you just couldn't really make up.
And that action at Jalajangi, it was the beginning of what would later transpire the great cooperation. I mean, you have CIA guys, Green Berets, SBS guys, Navy SEAL, probably at that time frame, they weren't used to all working together. This was like the first time. Now, of course, what later transpired, excuse me, in Afghanistan, these guys would all work together much closer. But that was the first probably, example of that happening, which I found interesting, because, when I first heard about what happened there, I didn't realize there was SBS guys there. And they really put some thunder down with the machine guns on the Taliban, not the Taliban, the Al-Qaeda guys in the compound. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, the funny thing about the SBS is Tony Blair was trying to have his cake and eat it, really, because he wanted the shoulder to shoulder, and he wanted the troops in, but he didn't want them being involved in a bloodbath in Kunduz, which is what his sort of generals were telling him. And so he put it on this national caveat that they couldn't take part in offensive actions. So they had to basically wait to be fired on. And so the SBS were not particularly happy about that, because that meant they couldn't be involved in, what looked like it was going to be the big fight in Kunduz. And they were even made to paint their Land Rovers white, so they looked like sort of humanitarian sort of vehicles. But they did have GPMGs. And so once the uprising happened, the SBS basically like, well, fuck that, mate. We're going to the fort. And they, ran towards the sound of gunfire with their GPMGs, hauled them up so I went up the stairs. There's this little tower on the sort of this little gateway and little courtyard. And then the eastern tower, all these like winding steps. And so they just like hauled up their GPM, took them off the Land Rovers, hauled them up the stairs and set them up on the eastern tower, which looks down over the southern compound and the pink house, which is the main building where the prisoners have been kept in the cellar and brought out that morning. And the cellar was it was like a fortified bunker because there'd been armaments kept in there, which was a problem because you couldn't destroy it. And they took refuge in there and used that as a sort of base. But the SBS got in there and killed, I don't know, scores and scores of them with their GPMGs. And there's a little bit of footage that you can find on YouTube that some Afghan took of them sort of,
I saw that. I looked that up.
Blasting away with their GPMGs. Yeah.
They were bringing some thunder down on those Al-Qaeda guys. And I have a good friend of mine who was a SBS guy. We worked private security together. So those guys have always had my respect. And it was funny because you mentioned at the time, they were considered like the weak sister to the SAS. I don't think anyone thinks about them as that anymore.
No, absolutely. No, I mean, there was, the SAS in Hereford and the SBS were seen as like, redheaded stepchildren or whatever the phrase is. And, but this sort of put them on the map. And so they, it's ironic because if it hadn't have been for this national caveat and the restricted, ROEs, they would have been in Kunduz, and so they wouldn't have been there. And so God knows what would have happened in terms of the uprising. I mean, David Tyson might have been killed, the whole, they could have taken over Mazar-e Sharif, which was the plan, which is like the Trojan horse plan. But no, they were in the right place at the right time, and they just, they just stepped up. And you're right. I mean, it's an incredible moment, really, of, for the first time of just cooperation between all these elements. Now, I mean, it was kind of messy at times. I mean, dropping a 2,000 pound JDAM, was a pretty big mistake, which was a pilot error, actually. Pilots switch around the coordinates, but then, of course, procedures were streamlined so that you didn't pass up friendly coordinates, because a similar thing happened on December the 5th in Tarin Kôt, where three Green Berets were killed. So there were certainly kinks to be worked out, but it did just show that, really at the end of the day, certainly with the Brits and the Americans, and also the different elements of, Green Berets, SEAL, U.S. Air Force, U.S. Marines in the air, it's all of one company, really, all one breed at the end of the day.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, you're now naturalized American citizen. Is your wife American?
So I'm divorced.
I'm sorry.
Ex-wife is American, and my girlfriend is American.
So I know you have two daughters.
But I got a Greek. I have a son and a daughter.
Oh, you have a son and a daughter. Did they speak with an English accent?
No, they don't. They say words like trousers and stuff sometimes, but they're basically American. And in fact, I've been American since 2009. And I think 9/11 was one of the reasons why I became American. I mean, I think being here on that day had a big effect on me, like it did many people. But they're eligible. The kids are eligible for UK citizenship, but I haven't done it yet. I must do it because you can't have too many passports in life. It's good to.
The reason I asked that is after my military days were over, I worked private security. I worked on a couple of Hollywood films as the security advisor for the overall, production. And on one of them, there was only like 3 Americans on the crew, me being one of them. And all the Brits picked up on my Boston accent because they were like, we could tell where you're from. And they could imitate my Boston accent very, very easily they could fall right into it. And then I would try my best to do an English accent, and they were like, not everyone's Cockney. He's like, all you Americans, all you do is Cockney accents. And I thought that was pretty funny, but no, but.
Well, I'm pretty useless at American accents. I can't do them. And obviously I've pretty much kept my British accent. But in Britain, there's so many, and in fact, on this SBS team, you know, it's a small island, but the regional variations in accent and dialect are sort of incredible. And, you know, on that team, there was, you know, a Geordie, there was somebody from the West Country, there was somebody from Yorkshire. And so actually some of the Green Berets were kind of like, you know, what's that guy speaking?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I can understand all the British accents, but the American ones, you know, I can tell when somebody's from Minnesota.
One
or
of
Boston,
my British friends,
beyond that, it's hard.
Ex-military, I visited him in England. We traveled all over, and it was funny because like you say, it's you don't traveling that far, but the accents would change. And then we went up almost in Scotland, and when we first got there, I was like, I said to my friend, "Hey, guy, are these guys speaking English? Because I can't understand anything they say." That accent was really strong, but no, it was.
Yeah, I mean, I was stationed in Rosyth in Fife, and some of the locals there, I mean, it was like you needed subtitles for an Englishman. It was pretty hard to understand them.
yeah, but no, I loved it over there, and I still have some good friends from there, so that's great. But again, Toby, thank you for taking the time today. I know our listeners out there, our readers from SOFREP.com, they will really enjoy this book. It's a great book. I think it's a story that needed to be told, and you know, the detail that's in this about how a handful of CIA paramilitary guys, the Green Berets, with some air power behind them, basically took Afghanistan. And then, you know, it's funny, I spoke with a deputy director of the CIA that ran the Afghanistan operation against the Russians with the Mujahideen. And, you know, he told me, he was like, we ran it perfectly right up until the end. And then he said, and then we fucked it all up.
Yeah.
And listeners, First Casualty, CIA, you know, secret, or first paramilitary guys on the ground in Afghanistan. Please check it out. Toby, thank you very much for joining us. Thanks for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. And I thank you for sharing your book with me.
Thanks so much, Steve. Well, happy to be on the show. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Have a happy holiday season. And if I'm ever up in the D.C. area, I would love to buy you a cup of coffee, or you a tea.
Yeah, look. Yeah, look me up. That'd be great.
That would be awesome, because that was one of the benefits of hanging out with the Brits. I became a tea snob. So now I'll only drink Dorset tea now. That's because...
okay. So most of the things I do, I feel like are American these days, but I still drink... In fact, this is tea. So I still drink several, not cups, mugs of tea a day. But I get what they call builder's tea. So it's like Tetley, actually from Yorkshire, but it's just tea you get in the supermarkets, nothing posh.
Yeah, I got one of my friends from Bournemouth sends me Dorset tea, because he was like, you can only drink Dorset tea. The rest of it, as he says, rubbish, mate. So, but all right. Well, thanks again, and we'll be.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Before we go, if you want to get SOFREP on your phone, download our free mobile app and get easy access to our articles, podcasts like this one, and gear reviews, all perfectly formatted to your device. Please subscribe to SOFREP.com to get access to our library of ebooks and our exclusive Team Room content and forums. Thanks again for listening. From myself, Steve Balestrieri, our special guest today, Toby, and thanks again. We'll be back with another podcast real soon.